So this presentation takes a look at the key changes in ISO 9001-2015 and IATF 16949-2016 affecting the human resources process in your organisation. My name is Paul Hardiman, Director of Quality Partner. I've been working with quality management systems for 25 years and I'm an IATF witness auditor and trainer. So let's take a look at the changes in the human resources process using the turtle diagram, starting with the inputs. So one of the inputs to the human resource process is going to be the organisation's strategic direction, which should take into account internal and external context. So this is really laying out the plan for the organisation, and part of the plan for the organisation will be making sure that we've got sufficient human resources to make sure we can fulfil the content of the strategic direction. So that would be a key input into the human resource process. We also need to take into account interested party requirements. So customers may have an influence on the human resource process by laying down specific requirements, but maybe there is certain regulatory requirements, for example, forklift truck driver training, where we need to take into account the competency of people driving forklift trucks, and other specialist skills where there are legal and regulatory requirements. Again, another example might be people operating cranes. So we need to take into account all interested party requirements. We need to take into account legal and statutory requirements that we have to meet. And last but not least, we need to take into account customer-specific requirements related to training. And I think this is one of the areas that we see more emphasis on in IATF 16949, that we do have people that are competent to interface with the relevant customer systems, which could be capacity planning, it could be how we process a sales order, various customer systems that we have to interact with, making sure we've got people with the right competencies. So these are some of the inputs to the human resource process. So now let's take a look at the output of the human resource process. So what are the outputs? Firstly, we need to make sure we've got resources available to meet the strategic direction of the organisation, and we've got the resources available to meet customer requirements. The second point is really related to a big change in ISO 9001-2015. This means that we have to have a process to retain organisation knowledge. And we need to retain organisation knowledge to achieve conformity of products and the services that we provide. So this really organisation knowledge can be maintained by making sure that we've got more than one person available to perform all of the different tasks around the organisation. So we could demonstrate that maybe through skill matrix, and that is not just production roles, that is all roles within the organisation. And in providing that, we are going to be thinking about the risk. What happens if key people leave the organisation? How do we make sure we retain sufficient knowledge? The second way that we could retain knowledge is by documented information. It may be standardised work that we've developed within production, it may be work instructions we've developed for other processes, but through a combination of skills and documented information, we need to make sure we are retaining organisation knowledge, and also if we're making any changes, that we develop the right knowledge depending on those changes that we're making. So that is one of the significant changes within the human resource process. The next thing we need to make sure is that people are aware of the quality policy, and remember the quality policy you may revise as part of the transition process, and we also need to make sure that people are aware of the quality objectives that affect their role and responsibility. This is not a brand new requirement, but as part of the transition, we may be changing the policy, we may be changing the objectives. So how are we communicating that to people within the organisation? So now let's take a look at the human resource process and the turtle diagram. Let's have a look at the how requirements. We've talked in previous presentations about contingency planning, the fact there are much stronger requirements now for contingency planning. And one element of a contingency plan is making sure that we have enough human resources to effectively operate all of our business processes to meet the customer requirement. So human resources should have some input into developing the contingency plan to make sure we've got the required human resources. Second point is about communication and awareness. Really, we do need to have a clear process for how we communicate internally and how we communicate externally, both to the customer and interested parties. And we do need to make sure that people are clearly aware of the organisation policy, their roles and their responsibilities. So it's not brand new, but I think more emphasis on effective internal and external communication. And again, this could be led by human resources. We need to make sure that we've got clearly assigned responsibility to ensure that we can meet all customer requirements. So again, this is making sure that we've got people skilled in the relevant customer systems that we need to interface with. Not new, but more emphasis on that within IATF 16949. We need now to have a documented process for how we motivate people within the organisation and how we empower people within the organisation, particularly how we empower them to make sure the organisation can meet the defined quality objectives. This specifically now needs to be a documented process within the scope of the quality management system. A difficult area, subjective area, but somehow we need to define how we're going to make sure that people really are supporting the implementation of an effective management system. And finally, we have to have a documented process for how we go about identifying the relevant training needs within our organisation, including the relevant awareness and competencies that we need. And again, this could be tied back to the organisation strategic direction. So I think human resources has a key role to play in the transition in making sure that we're upskilling people to give them the right skills to understand, for example, risk-based thinking, to get them to understand their roles and responsibilities to make sure they can fulfill customer requirements. And obviously we've seen there are more emphasis on employee safety, and often that is managed within the human resource process to make sure that we're looking after people's health and well-being. So now let's take a look at the physical part of the human resource process. And there are some requirements that I've put within the with what box of the turtle diagram related to having the right work environment. Now, a lot of people, when they read the word work environment, just think about the physical aspects of the work environment, how the plant is laid out, how it's maintained clean, maybe using a 5S system. But within the ISO 9001 requirement, it broadens it beyond that. It talks about having a non-discriminatory process, a calm environment, non-confrontational environment, a stress-reducing environment, how we're protecting burnout of employees. These things are only given there as guidance, but what it's saying is when we think about the work environment, don't just think about the physical. Think about the people well-being and how we're going to make sure we create the right work environment to motivate people to help the organisation achieve the relevant objectives. So this is a new area that ISO 9001 is leading us into, and obviously we need to audit that process to verify that it's effective. So now let's think about the with who part of the turtle diagram for human resources. One of the key things that we really do need to focus upon is the competency of external providers. We need to make sure that external providers that we're using for any tasks that could affect compliance within the quality management system are competent to undertake that allocated task. And we can't just assume this to be the case. We need to keep documented information that any of these external providers is providing us with people that have the relevant competencies. So that is, I think, an important change. We also need to make sure for each of our quality management system processes that we've clearly defined competent process owners. And we need to make sure that these process owners have the relevant competencies to manage their allocated process. And again, we cannot just assume this. We need to keep documented information saying what is the competency required to be a process owner and how have people got those competencies? Has it been by on-the-job training? Has it been by education? Has it been by training? But how have people got the relevant competencies? So let's now summarise the changes within the human resource process that we need to consider to make a successful transition to IATF 16949, including compliance with ISO 9001-2015. I think personally one of the key requirements is the ISO 9001 requirement about how do we retain the relevant organisation knowledge. So even though that's not an additional IATF requirement, we still need to make sure that we are meeting the ISO 9001-2015 requirements. As I mentioned earlier, that could be a combination of developing people skills that we're not dependent on individuals, but also developing the relevant degree of documentation to support the effective operation of all our quality management processes, not just production, that if we need work instructions for how to process a sales order, that we keep that within the control of the quality management system. So I think that's one of the fundamental changes. The second one is to make sure that we've got people with competency working on the organisation behalf. So where we're using outsourced organisations to top up our skills and bring in the specialist skills, that we've got documented information that those people have got the relevant skills to better perform the tasks that we're allocating them. So more emphasis about that. I think a really interesting change is about creating the right work environment. Not just a physical environment, but making sure that we have the right environment to look after the people's health, look after the people's well-being, look after the people's safety, and create the environment that people are going to feel stimulated to help the quality management system achieve its desired output. More emphasis on a clear policy of communication and awareness. As well as the quality policy, we also need to think about corporate social responsibility. And for example, if I'm an employee and I think there's something wrong going on within the organisation, I should have the ability of what is called a whistleblowing policy. I can go and talk to top management and I say, I think something is going on within the organisation that is not right. I should have that ability to go and talk to top management. So the corporate responsibility policy now needs to be part of the quality management system. So when you look at this, don't just look at the quality policy requirement, think about the overall policy for the organisation. There's more emphasis on responsibilities and competencies to ensure that we can meet customer requirements. So this is making sure people have got all the relevant skills to interact effectively with the customer and importantly, the customer systems. And finally, this requirement to have clearly defined process owners that are competent to make sure that the process works effectively to meet the customer requirement, and those process owners are promoting risk-based thinking to the people that are working within the process. Again, I think that's one of the fundamental changes. So I think human resources have a very big part to play in making a successful transition to ISO 9001-2015 and IATF 16949-2016.